So how does liberalism explain war? Right? Liberalism is essentially a theory about the possibility of cooperation. How does it explain war? Or to put it differently, if the security dilemma is solvable, why throughout history do we see states going to war over and over and over again? The basic answer from liberalism is that just because the security dilemma can be solved doesn't mean that it will be. And various liberal theories point to various kinds of things that can go wrong in trying to solve the security dilemma. Domestic politics, sometimes there are strong domestic factors that make leaders makes it very costly for leaders to make concessions. Sometimes there are powerful militaries who have an interest, if not in going to war, then at least threatening going to war. Sometimes there's misperception. There's just a misunderstanding of what the nature of the situation is. And of course, sometimes there are authoritarian governments that might actually perceive an advantage, a boost to their public opinion by going to war. So as an example, let's go back to a topic we've already talked about, which is from the concert of Europe to World War I. And this is a good case where to think about how liberals frame the question. They don't really frame the question as much as why did war happen, rather than as how did cooperation break down, or why did cooperation break down. And I'm not going to go through all that history in great detail, but let me just point to some of the big issues that arose roughly between the 1880s or 90s and the outbreak of World War I. So one was that the domestic politics in Germany basically made it so that the leaders of Germany at the time, Bismarck in particular and Kaiser Wilhelm, struck a deal in which they argued that they would protect agricultural interests. In return, they would also protect steel interests. And so this so-called coalition of iron and rye led to an increase in protectionism. And that injured Russian agricultural interests and built up the hostility between Russia and Germany. Moreover, in both Germany and England, there was a lot of support for building more weapons. In particular, there was a naval arms race, but also lots of buildings of artillery and things like that. Why did our industrialists like building these things? Well, one of the major industries in the world at that time was steel. And the weapons of the time were very dependent on steel, so this was good for major firms in both countries. Nationalism in the Balkans, right? We talked about the role of Serb nationalists in assassinating the Archduke and the weakness of the Austrian monarchy, because all over the Austrian Empire, different groups were seeking their own nation states. So nationalism was a factor. We also talked about the Schlieffen Plan, right? Germany's war plans short-circuited the diplomatic process because the German army basically said to the leaders, if there's going to be a war, we've got to go fast, right? Because once the Russians start mobilizing, the clock's ticking on us. And so the war plans had big consequences for the diplomatic process. And finally, Germany failed to anticipate that Britain would join the war. Germany believed that Britain would stand aside. And Germany never really imagined what eventually happened, which was that the US got involved in the war from all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, you can actually fault Britain or the United States to some extent, thinking if they had said clearly in 1914 that we absolutely are going to join this war, maybe that would have had some impact on Germany, but they both had their own reasons for not doing that. Namely, going to war was not especially popular, especially in the US. So contrast that with what happened after World War II, right? The US and Soviet Union were intense rivals, right? They were geopolitical rivals fighting for who was going to control not only Europe, but much of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And there was this deep ideological conflict. The Soviet Union was communist and atheistic, and the United States was capitalist and democratic and pretty religious. There was a massive arms race, right? Building all of these nuclear weapons, right? Enough weapons to blow up the world 7 or 8 times over, depending on which statistics you read. And there was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 when they came that close, right? Kennedy said later the chances of going to war were between 2 out of 3 and even. But they didn't. And then after the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1970s was this period that was known as détente, which is a French word that means a release of tension. There was the Limited Test Ban Treaty, limiting the testing of nuclear weapons in 1963, and then some very major arms control treaties in the 1970s. And the SALT II Treaty in 1977 is pretty interesting because the U.S. Senate refused to ratify the treaty because they thought that the Soviets were cheating too much. So there was a case where domestic politics kind of started to get in the way. But both U.S. presidents at the time, first Jimmy Carter in the late 1970s and then Ronald Reagan for most of the 1980s, one a Democrat and one a Republican, said, even though the Senate has not ratified the treaty, we are going to abide by the treaty. And so the U.S. did abide by that treaty, and so did the Soviet Union. So even the domestic politics were worked in a way to promote cooperation. And the argument from the liberal perspective is that if this most intense rivalry in history could end without war, then this sort of proves our point, they would say, that these kinds of rivalries can be managed without war. So what do you think? What are the strengths and weaknesses of this liberal explanation of war and peace?